for if folks are running late or there's traffic on the interweb. So yeah, just bear with us for a couple secs.
Let's see. Okay. Neil, can you see the Q&A? It's not really a question, just a statement of encouragement.
Yes, yes, I can. Thank you.
Oh, hi everyone. Just a note, Connor used the Q&A. I just want to make sure everyone knows how to use that or where that button is. It's at the bottom of your screen towards the right. So we're asking people to not use the chat function, to just limit your questions to the Q&A section. So as per usual, the GPAX talks, what we're gonna do is we're gonna keep Q&A to the end unless you have a clarifying question, if it's about like a particular acronym that needs to be explained or something like that. But aside from that, we kindly request that you hold your questions till the end.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for organizing this, and Andy for doing the technical work. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for attending. The title of my talk is Power Sharing in a Pandemic, the Northern Ireland Assembly and COVID-19. And it's less of a, well, I hope it's coherent, but it's less of a real thought out argument and more things I'm currently finding interesting, a little bit of a reflection on what I'm doing, and just sort of some ideas that I have thrown around that I think might be helpful and important going forward. So the first thing I want to do is I want to acknowledge in Northern Ireland this past weekend was the 1-year anniversary of the murder of a journalist named Leora McKee by a paramilitary organization that called themselves the New IRA. And I wanted to just acknowledge her death, especially as while I did not know her personally, she was very good friends with many of my friends. And I think that it's important, especially as we go through what's going on in Northern Ireland, that this be part of the context. And my friend Cara Hunter, who is a counselor in the city of Derry, Londonderry, posted this tribute. So I just wanted to acknowledge that first and foremost. Excuse me. So this image is one that I've seen shared by multiple different people in the North and around, and it sort of is the key sort of message that governments have been sending. So again, this idea of stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. And so I was looking at it, and I thought my talk, I think, would be particularly helpful if we think about this question of, staying at home. So what does that mean for research, right? Like especially research of government. Protecting the NHS, or the National Health Service, right, which is the United Kingdom's national health plan. Really creating my question of what is the role of the Northern Ireland Assembly, which I am going to be calling by its colloquial name STORMONT, in combating COVID-19. And then again, this question of saving lives, right? And I was thinking a lot about the role of life in Northern Ireland. So again, this question of how will STORMONT's actions on COVID-19 impact peace building going forward? So of those sort of three categories, those are the main three categories that I'm going to be talking about. So briefly, I wanted to really kick off, and we can talk more about this as well during the Q&A, about what COVID's immediate impact has been on my research. The joke I've sort of been saying is I've gone from sore feet to sore thumbs, where I used to be walking around both the city of Belfast or in Belfast City Hall or in the STORMONT building themselves, talking to people and sitting in chambers, talk to people, whereas now I am mostly looking at social media as my main sort of field site. And I think that that shift has been interesting from an ethnographic perspective, but also just from a reimagining for myself of what the field is. So I think I'm the only human on earth who will say thank goodness for Twitter. But I think it's important to understand that Northern Ireland is a country that is the size of the US state of Connecticut, with half of Connecticut's population. And so Twitter actually has become a site of real meaningful political discourse because there's a localized discussion. And because of that, there's a real discourse happening in real time by elected officials in ways that I think are particularly unique to the Northern Ireland experience. Finally, I want to just quickly note, I made the choice to stay. I'm broadcasting from Belfast, Northern Ireland. It has been uncharacteristically sunny here. But I chose to stay. I'm really privileged to be able to stay put in my research site. And that's been has its own set of challenges and its own set of rewards. So I have been able to sort of monitor this in real time, but it also, I think, does put a different form of politics onto what my research is right now. So moving forward. So STORMONT, like, what is this institution, STORMONT? So STORMONT, up until January of 2020, was actually a government and legislature that was not functioning. There had been a collapse of leadership, and so those issues ended up becoming new questions. Oops, sorry, I'm seeing. Yeah, sorry, saw something in the chat there. So I'm basing all of this, and a lot of my original research was really thinking through what is the role of legislature in peace building. So I initially was looking at Alana Gershen's work, right, where she is working in New Zealand, thinking about how parliaments are about contesting definitions, right, and really thinking about how the law creates and defines, almost in a Weberian ideal types, right, way of what things should be. And I was thinking about that, and then I was really engaging Jennifer Curtis's work, where she on Northern Ireland in particular, where she thinks through this idea of point scoring, right, where so Northern Ireland up until 1998 was in an ethnic, sectarian, political conflict known as the Troubles. And the Troubles was ostensibly between, some would call them Catholic, some would say it's Catholics versus Protestants. Because I'm talking in political terms, and again, I'm very vastly oversimplifying a very complex conflict. So, I for the purposes of this, I'm talking about nationalists versus unionists. So nationalists were people who wanted to reunify the island of Ireland to have one island republic, and unionists who again wanted to keep the sovereign relationship between the United Kingdom, the rest of the United Kingdom and Great Britain with Northern Ireland. And so what Jennifer Curtis was thinking through was this idea of point scoring, where in the conflict you often had literal tit for tat violence, right, of you shoot one of my community, I'll shoot one of yours, and how that then was transferred and translated into human rights law post 1998, when a document called the Good Friday Agreement was signed and brought forward, which really reignited political institutions like STORMONT. So what that point scoring ended up looking like was questions of, well, if we're going to have a law that, says that we're going to recognize Irish Gaelic as an official language, we also need a law that recognizes the minority language of Ulster Scots. And because of this, we have to have that. And in that sort of form of point scoring, what Eleanor Wicki, who's a literature and theater scholar, surmised was she was saying that, you know, Stormont has often been treated as an indicator of the peace process in Northern Ireland. And this idea that if the Northern Ireland Assembly is functioning, that means society is functioning. And I'm really trying to think through that right now. And I'm not sure if I mean, I agree, but I'm not sure. There's something about that is vexing me. And I think that I would love to hear more from you all during the Q&A about how to work through that. And so again, I think that it's important to understand, right, that so in the past 3 years, right, there have been a lot of point scoring, and this idea of the assembly hasn't been functioning, right, and it only just started up again in January. So what that means and what that looks like has been greatly impacted by COVID. Having trouble with my slides. Yes, okay, here we go. So what is going on now with COVID and Stormont? So Northern Ireland and the Stormont executive, the Powersharing executive, that is based on a mandatory coalition between two parties from the historical communities, right, which right now are Sinn Féin from the nationalist side, who seek to unify the island of Ireland, and the Democratic Unionist Party, who seek to maintain the sovereign relationship with the United Kingdom, have been thrust in with this mandatory legal coalition into government in January. So for them, they are now reckoning of what's going on with the coronavirus. And so Northern Ireland itself has been pulled in two directions, where literally where the United Kingdom has taken a very herd immunity approach, less interested in up until recently in locking down and more in very sort of hands-off, whereas the Republic of Ireland really took a draconian approach from the beginning with school closures, and recently there has been a limit on how far people can travel, of a maximum of 2-kilometer radius from where you live, and real just sort of intense emphasis on testing and tracing the virus and really mapping what's going on. So Northern Ireland is sort of stuck in the middle of this, and this real question of like, who do we follow, right? The people we share a legal and financial sovereign relationship with, or the literal people we share land and space with. And what has happened recently has been a division based on the historical lines of the conflict in a very sort of neo-sectarian way, which is like one of my interlocutors, you know, exasperatedly said to me, like, why does it always come down to our history? And what's sort of crucial is there have been 2 points of contention. So the first point of contention is on the physical land border between Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland. And you can see from these graphics, Gabriel Scally is a epidemiologist who is from Northern Ireland, but has worked both in Great Britain and the Republic. And you can see here, right, that what's going on is there's a severe logistical problem where, you know, towns that are 3 miles away from each other have different isolation points, but they are 2 different states. And so how the executive has dealt with that border, especially in the context of Brexit, has been up for discussion. And that has not necessarily been resolved. This is still the case right now of if you go in one, you know, you cross one way, you will have to have a very different standard of how the disease is being treated versus the other. The second major point of contention that's caused a lot of real discussion of history is the role of the British Army. So during the Troubles in the 1970s and 80s, there was a major presence of British soldiers in Northern Ireland, and many nationalists and Republicans saw that as a form of imperialism, whereas a lot of Unionists and Loyalists saw that as a being protected by their sovereign state. And so typically, like, you know, in the United States, when the governor of the state you're living in mobilizes the National Guard to, you know, assist with pandemic response, typically the British Army is supposed to come in and assist in building field hospitals and distributing PPE and other forms of prevention and basically, you know, crisis emergency response. That decision of trying to call in the Army caused a huge rift within the executive, the power sharing executive, because of the historical meaning of what the image and role of the British Army is. So Michelle O'Neill, who is currently the Deputy First Minister and from the party Sinn Féin, a nationalist Republican party, has been particularly outspoken in being very concerned about that decision, especially as other members of the executive have said, you know, we need to save lives, let's come together. So we have you have very much two sort of sets of discourses. You have a historical discourse, and you have a current on the ground, we need to save lives question. And again, the Army is still, all of this is also happening very much in real time. The Army, the point of contention around the Army still has not been figured out. So what has this all meant then, right? With these points of contention, that how they've been dealt with has meant that there's been a major change in politics as usual. And those two examples, I think, are really helpful case studies to understand what's going on. So there's been obviously changes in form and function, right? And the role of e-parliaments, right, an internet-based parliamentary activity is becoming increasingly important and a really key set of inquiry for me right now, along with this question of changes in scrutiny. So how we look at potential laws, how we look at potential legislation and policies are now being done via the internet and via very different forms of communication. And thus there's been a lot of questions and criticisms from parliamentarians about whether or not there's a proper legislative procedure and what that looks like and how we can really interrogate and represent our constituents in the way we're supposed to, based on, you know, taking time to really examine the written words that we're voting on. And what that's meant also from this scrutiny perspective is that the executive, right, the leaders of government have become much more important than in other times, in my opinion. I think that the power sharing, Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin, as well as other parties that are part of the key executive, but those two main parties means that they matter so much more because they're the ones who bring the legislation in. And there has been less time for real questioning and real examination of what it is that's being done. And this is not just a Northern Ireland problem. This morning, the Parliament at Westminster, the Parliament of Great Britain, for the first time in 700 years, created mechanisms for voting for members of parliament who weren't in the physical chamber. And so again, this is not, you know, unique, but I think it exposes some real questions about the future of lawmaking and what that's going to mean going forward. And what that's also meant in the Northern Ireland Assembly in Stormont has meant that anything that has been seen as controversial is being bracketed to the side because of limitations in how laws can be made. So in both Westminster and in Stormont, whenever there's a real close vote, members will physically walk through one door or walk through another for yes or no to that proposal. And that's called having a division. What the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly said last month is divisions make social distancing difficult. They should be avoided, right? Like we can't have people walking in lines and being in certain rooms to count votes because that's going to be an issue for social distancing. So again, we're having scrutiny issues and not necessarily tackling potentially divisive issues because of the need for this virus. And something else I've noticed, again, I'm not sure where I'm going with all of this, but I think that there's something in there, and hopefully all of you can help me work it out, is this idea of political parties as service providers, right? No longer are they representations of a certain ideology or a certain point of view, but instead they're really serving as a new form of local connection. And I'll talk about that more in a second. So we saw, right, as COVID-19 gained speed and power, we saw these are just examples of those changes, of limiting the number of members of the Legislative Assembly in the chamber, changing seating patterns to increase social distancing, the executive themselves producing material, excuse me. But it's important to note that on a very local level, what we also saw was local government coming together, and we can see here for the city of Lisbon, different councilors from different areas coming together to work to combat the virus. Excuse me. And by those coming together, you see here a very different picture, right, of these politicians on local micro levels creating a sort of united front against the virus versus the executive, which may or may not be working. So again, we have these parties as service providers, right? And these are all just examples of things that every party on here has done some version of, whether it be how to wash your hands, supporting of care workers, advice on where to get food, real sort of questions of what's the future of the nation, where are we going? And really, again, the sort of local level, don't come, save lives, stay at home. And I'm, again, particularly interested in the sort of mixed messaging, right? Where on one level we're all in this together, we're all doing this, but also, again, this sort of point scoring of, hey, I'm going to wash my hands because Sinn Féin told me to, or type thing. And so, again, I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but I think that there's definitely something there of how parties and sites and institutions are shifting going forward, right? Because it's not, STORMONT has produced some things, and again, I showed you, here on the top right with the executive sort of literature, but on social media, these are the things that are constantly being bombarded at everyday citizens. And again, every single party here has produced every single type of communication on this page. So what does that mean for peace, right? Like what is this going to mean from a peace building perspective? And for those of you who have listened to me kvetch about my project for years, I've cared very much about STORMONT, but it wasn't initially running when I started this research. So I became really interested now of what's so important about STORMONT, right? If STORMONT is this symbol for peace, we've also had this constant assumption for years that it's dysfunctional. And does that mean that if there's contention, does that mean that people are going to be constantly skeptical about peace, even in a pandemic? Right, even when we're supposed to be working together, we're still skeptical of each other. And what does that mean for peace? Sorry, clearly I haven't talked this much in a while, so my voice is like, what are you doing? So what I'm thinking through right now is how COVID-19 is and will be a test for STORMONT as an institution and its power sharing executive, right? Because COVID-19 has nothing to do with the past in Northern Ireland, but it's also bringing up things and real forms and functions of how Northern Irish lawmaking works that may expose, right, key features of going forward, whether or not this will work. And, you know, there's been ever since in January when the government came back, there's been this clear sentiment among my interlocutors of, it has to work this time. It has to work this time. And I'm interested to see how COVID-19 is becoming the test of whether or not it's going to work this time. And so I ask, you know, does this mean that it's a test for peace? Excuse me. And I think that it's important when we look towards this, right, of what that test is going to look like and how major this test is. So Ellen Murray, who's a friend of mine, an activist here in Northern Ireland, made the key point when the health minister said that COVID could rapidly dwarf the impact of the Troubles. And I excuse the vulgar language in her tweet, but I think it's very, you know, emphatic about what this is and how important this virus is and what that means going forward. And I think that Edwin Poots, as journalist Mark Davenport reported, of what he's comparing to the Troubles and COVID now, says a lot about how the executive is treating this virus and going forward. And I think, again, and this past weekend was the anniversary of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, right? And we have Julian Smith, who used to be the United Kingdom's envoy to Northern Ireland, saying, good thing you all came back together because of what was coming. So with that, I want to conclude by, you know, thinking through these three statements as a sort of summing up of what's going on now, but really, what does this mean then for a study of Parliament? You have Deputy First Minister and part of the executive saying, this isn't about politics, it's about saving lives. But then you also have Mark Davenport again saying, well, this coalition was set up to end a conflict. It wasn't set up to fight a pandemic. So then what is this power sharing coalition going to do? And what does that mean in a pandemic? And quite sobering, but also I think particularly important was Health Minister Robin Swan saying, you know, at the end of the day, the only thing that will divide us is between those who live and those who are dead. And I think that that's a very sobering note, but also a real, almost poignant example of the stakes of this and what that will mean for both peace, but also legislation in general in Northern Ireland going forward, and policy as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to have a little bit more water. For those of you who enjoyed the television show Dairy Girls, you might find the second image funny.
All right, Neil, thank you so much.
Of course.
Yeah, so if people want to start posting questions in the Q&A, so we can just make sure people go in order, and then we can start addressing them, or if people want to say their questions.
Comments are also welcome, as are, you know, reactions. Yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going with all of this, but I do think there's something going on there. So if folks can, you know, want to help me fill in this web a bit, that would be great.
Okay, so the first question is from Misbah. Can you see it in the chat, Neil?
Oh, let me see here. Aha.
Misbah, do you want to say your question, or are you good with just typing it? Let's see.
Yeah, so I don't know if can attendees turn their mics on, or
you know
if
what,
not,
so okay, Sturgio says, can we speak instead of asking Tori questions? So we're gonna, if everybody wants to put their questions in here just so we can keep track of the order, because we don't want to lose anyone, and Misbah is saying she doesn't think she can unmute.
Okay, that's fine. So Misbah asked, going back to Mark Davenport's tweet, what would you consider the functional difference between a parliament that is designed to address conflict versus a pandemic? I think, and yeah, this is something that I need to think through further, but I think it's to that question of power sharing. And the big problem we see right now in Northern Ireland is that this is a mandatory coalition. It's not a coalition that's based on a shared philosophical ideas around policy and what that policy should look like. Instead, it's based on, through the Good Friday Agreement, the establishment of ensuring that everybody is represented in government, even if they disagree. And so I think that that functionality is its own problem, where, I think even in, say the United States, where government right now very much disagrees with each other, right, on certain policy ideas, on a fundamental level, there is a consciousness that everybody believes in America as a state, or well, as a nation and as a country and as a state. And I'm still playing around with state, nation, country as part of this. So I think that's one of the key elements to it. Oh, hi, Professor Bolins. Yeah, so Professor Bolins asks, is there tracking of nationalist versus unionist COVID deaths? Not that I know of. I think that would probably cause some controversy. Once things have calmed down a little, I might look into that a little bit more. I think that I think that that's the real issue also that's coming down to this, that I need to play around with as well, on the layers of local counselors getting together and parties as service providers versus the executive, and sectarianism is the role of class. And so I think that there's a real, obviously there's a class element to this. And I think we'll see though, that the people who are going to be hit the hardest are the very much inner city, Belfast, depraved urban areas, and Derry, Londonderry as well. And so I think that what we'll end up seeing, sadly, is that it's the extremes of the nationalist and unionist communities that are the people who prop up the two parties in the executive who are going to be hit the hardest. And I think that that's a really sad thing, but I do think that that does tell us something a little bit about what's going on. Just even before I jumped on here, there was a real question about whether or not graveyards should be open for people to visit their deceased loved ones, or if they should be closed because of the pandemic. And that the responses to that have been a very classed response. And I think that going forward, there are going to be a lot of questions about that. Again, the same issues of a lot of deaths right now are happening in care homes and nursing homes, and I think that's its own issue as well.
Neil,
and who is living
Neil,
and who is dying
I'm sorry.
will definitely be an issue.
Neil, I may be unmuted.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yes, I think so.
Good. I have a more general question. Do you think that COVID has overall helped you or hindered you in?
Yeah, I mean, I think STORMONT coming back really helped my project. I was sort of actually I see two of my committee members on here. And so, I think you could all tell when I was working on this that I really wanted this to come back. And I care very deeply for this institution. So that really helped. I think it has helped my project in that it's given something that is not necessarily a historical issue to the forefront of what Northern Ireland's political future is going to be. It's hindered in that, I personally, in my sort of ethnographic ideology or the methods I enjoy are being out and about with people at these meetings and watching. And so I think I'm in some ways, being limited to Twitter, not getting that full holistic epistemological approach. At the same time, I think that selfishly, where I'm at right now, COVID has been helpful for my project in that I'm able to see government in action, no matter what. Unlike, I think, unfortunately, some of my colleagues' projects where, you know, their entire work has had to shut down because of that. Oh, I see Professor Bernal also sent in a question. Thanks so much, Scott. So yeah, so Victoria asks, hi Neil, I think this crisis exposes cracks and flaws in the system as we are seeing in the US. Say a little bit more about that. Yeah, I think the biggest, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, where an interlocutor about this yesterday, where I think the biggest difference between what's going on in Northern Ireland and what's going on in the United States is, again, this assumption and question of what is the state for, right? What is the role of government? And I think that in Northern Ireland, where you have a national health system, which, by the way, you do not have in the Republic of Ireland, even though they still have a more nationalized health system than the United States. Again, I mean, all these things are not black and white. I think that in Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK and the Republic, to some extent, there is this idea that government should be providing care. And I think that those, and I think that that's a big fundamental difference that needs to be understood. And I think that that's also, as you're asking, I'm sort of thinking as well, what, not just what the state is for and what the role of government is, but also that might be the link to why I was initially resistant to this idea of STORMONT as the barometer of peace, because I think that initially I was, just from my own, in some ways, consciousness, being very resistant to that, only because I did not grow up in a system where the state was really supposed to provide for you as much as I wanted it to. So yeah, definitely. I also definitely owe you an email, and we will definitely talk about this further. Cool. So Caitlin asks, have you tapped into any of the literatures on the anthropology of disaster? No, not just because this is all like day to day, so sudden. That's a really good idea. I should. I think something I have been looking at is I was looking at, actually last night, some early Marshall Solom's work on big events, and this idea that a little thing can turn into having so much meaning among different parties and states. And so this question of like, what is a critical event and what does that look like? And I think that those moments are right there interesting for me. I should look into disasters. I'm right now trying really hard to keep it in the sort of boundary of STORMONT in many ways, just because I like STORMONT and, sort of like the privilege of staying in one's comfort zone during the pandemic. I think I'm going to exercise as long as possible. But yeah, that's a really interesting suggestion. And I acknowledge that this is a disaster and, that sort of response, but I hadn't thought of it from that approach. So, hey, Connor. Connor's question, does Northern Ireland's unique relationship with its bordering states and broader European ties affect its COVID-19 response? Help us make sense of the strategic and rhetorical differences between the Northern Ireland Assembly and the federal government. Yes and no. I think so. Brexit has also was supposed to be what my project was about to some extent, and then this happened. I think that it has, but the other problem with the sort of Europeanness of all of this is that it's definitely, we're also dealing right now with two islands, right? And I think scale is an important element that I need to keep remembering every time I'm working with this project, right? Where I need to always remember that Northern Ireland is the size of Connecticut with half of Connecticut's population versus the United States, which I never realized how big really the US was until I started living in Belfast. And I think that does play into it the same. But I do think that there is a lot to be shown and given there. I think there is lessons that can be learned, but I also think that there is a deeply, I think there's a very different, almost to use the anthropological term, legal consciousness around how policies and parties and people should ask. And again, this is, that's a very sort of universal way of saying it, obviously, and there are exceptions, but I do think, yeah, that there's definitely Northern Ireland, I think, is also very much used to being a site of international tension and a site of dysfunction in many ways. And so I think the United States is not used to appearing on a global scale as a dysfunctional site. And so I think that the whole thing, as I was saying at the end, this sort of, we assume this is a beacon of peace and we're always skeptical if it's going to work. Maybe we'll be skeptical of peace. And I think that adds into it. I know for me, I'm not used to, actually, that's not true. I've always been kind of critical of my country. I say with a lot of love for it, but I definitely, on a sort of larger trend scale, have not seen as much frustration, I think, with the United States as a place on the same scale as everybody has been with Northern Ireland for a very long time. I hope that answers your question. As Professor Scarpadas asks, after Brexit, there seem to be polls showing a slight majority in favor of reunification. What do you think the economic downturn that is being induced will have on the views about reunification? Yeah, so that is a very good question. I think there are two parts to that. One, people are, because there are two radically different approaches to combating the virus. There are some people who I think have their desire for remaining in the United Kingdom has been reignited by love and pride in country for Boris Johnson, for the UK Prime Minister who had COVID, for Prince Charles, who had COVID. And so I think that there's been a poignancy around there. At the same time, I think Brexit also initially had created this idea of potential reunification. I think also the lessons being taught about life and state building right now is the role of the NHS, the National Health Service. And because the Republic of Ireland does not have as complete and holistic health service as the United Kingdom, that's always been one of the major sticking points for people who would generally be, mild unionists, but they really want the NHS. And so I think a lot of people who are pro reunification would say to me is, it's not just that I want reunification, it's that I want the island of Ireland to be a socialist island of Ireland. And so I think what the economic downturn might either help or hurt is what comes out after that. There was an election in the Republic of Ireland in February that had a very populist response, but the government to come out of that may not be a reflection of that populist response. And so because of that, I think what's going to happen is, it all depends. I mean, again, all of these are moving parts. All of these depend on different things. But I think it happens with what type of state action happens as the economic downturn really begins to rear its head. And when again, as the virus itself, sort of as lockdowns cease and everything, I think how different governments respond are going to be really helpful for that. At the same time, I think that there's also been, again, to use legal consciousness as an example, I have friends here who, no matter how many times you tell them, believe that it is the law in Belfast that you cannot be more than 2 kilometers outside of your own home, which it technically isn't. That's the law in the Republic. But I think that because of how urgent and serious and, again, draconian, but not necessarily in a bad way. It's human rights now is such a weird sort of moment of like, not that draconian. Because of that, how draconian initially the Republic of Ireland has been, I think a lot of people have followed their model in the interest of saving lives. And I will say it is working. The estimates yesterday showed that initially last month, there would be 15,000 people dying in Northern Ireland, but because of everybody, staying home, social distancing, lockdown, basically, it has gotten to be at least a fifth of that, if not a 15th. So I am feeling relatively positive from a health and safety perspective, but I'm not sure what that's going to mean for STORMONT and for legal and political relationships going forward. Also, if you have not watched the show Dairy Girls on Netflix, I would highly recommend it.
So it appears that we have answered everybody's questions. Neil, thank you so much. I realize it's much later where you are, so we especially appreciate you doing this now. And everybody take care. We're going to send out information. There's going to be another talk at the same time next week. Alina will be sending an email. Have a great Tuesday. Oh, wait, we have one more. Oh, just a congratulatory comment.
Thanks.
All right.
I have a comment, Sarah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Not about the way we do this, and probably it's better not to do a webinar, but just set up a regular meeting with a password. I think it's been working well with other seminars that I have facilitated actually in the Department of Economics, and it seems to be that you have more. You can see who is around. People have more control over whether they have video or not, and things like that, and that makes it closer to a regular kind of talk, if you can have anything like that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Sturgis.
So maybe you can just, you can, with your Zoom account, you can just set up a seminar, a scheduled seminar, and just set up the controls. Just say you just have a specific word and a specific number for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we can do it like that because I think it's easier and more social, let's put it this way.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So I'll just talk to